So if you stick around for the full episode, I'm going to show you what you need and how you're going to make your own mini Grand Prix bike, like the one shown here. You're going to need all these things to make the mini bike a bike. If any of you are interested in where I sourced all of my parts for this project, just leave a comment and I'll make sure to update the video with a detailed list of where all of the parts came from, and I might also add roughly how much they cost. So this is a crucial step before you begin designing the chassis. You need to know what you're working with. So you need to make sure you have all your parts on hand so you can get all of your critical measurements, and then you can come up with a design to fit your engine, suspension and swing arm, and not to mention wheels and tyres. The next most critical thing to make this all happen is a chassis jig. Now this needs to be set up accurately. That's what my mate David is doing, using a drawing on his phone that he came up with in Fusion 360. So from there, the first thing we're going to do is make the steering head. This is just a piece of pipe, and we're facing both ends in the lathe, so when we go to press in the bearing seats, we know they are both going to be parallel to each other. And then I decided to take a quick skim pass to clean up the exterior for welding. So these are the bearing seats I prepared earlier. These were turned on the lathe and they are just a nice locating press fit into the piece of pipe. Once they're pressed in, we squeeze it together in a vise and then use the trusty TIG welder to go around and fuse the bearing seats to the pipe. What you're looking at is a piece of 19mm tube with a nut welded on either end. This is to simulate the swing arm. We have this fixed in the jig so we can build the frame around it. Now what you're looking at is me parting off essentially two custom washers with a locating shoulder. These slip into a piece of tube and then they are fusion welded around, and these here become the swing arm pivots. It's way less material intensive than making it from one solid piece of round bar. And then it's back to the trusty TIG welder to stick them together. So this is the 19mm tube I was talking about with the swing arm pivots bolted to it. So now all we have to do is join the frame around it. Setting up the jig in itself is a fairly easy task. You just need to make sure everything is level, so the upright is perpendicular to the ground. Use a compound square to set the steering head angle, and then I use these two nylon cones, tighten down, and they align the steering head. From there, what we did was measured the distance from the center of the steering head to each edge of the swing arm pivot and made sure they were equal. Also from there, I double checked this by clamping a bar along the front of the jig, you can't see it here, and then measuring back to the swing arm pivots to make sure they were parallel to the length of the frame. So what you see here is I'm quickly constructing an engine mount. This is just some recycled steel I had lying around. It's very beefy, probably very overkill, but it'll do. And then the next thing to do was weld the whole frame together. This was done with my WIA Weldmatic 200i using 100% CO2 gas, only because it's cheap and I can get it refilled down at the local fire extinguisher place. The next thing to do is just make sure everything is level. A level is critical here. I mean, it is a fairly rudimentary tool, but there aren't many other ways unless you have a much more complicated, expensive jig to get everything perfect. Once all of your mounts are in their final position, bolted up to the engine and the jig, the next thing to do is start bending some tubes. So what you saw there was a little 3D printed template. I used this to grind the profile on all of the tubes by hand, and it was good enough for rough. Now, once I bent one tube, I would mark it out and bend the other, and I would try get them as close to parallel as possible. So obviously this isn't CNC and nothing is going to be exact or perfect, but that doesn't really matter to a degree, because as long as your frame is all aligned, you won't notice the difference, and nothing in this world is perfect. So all the tubes are bent, and then the next step is to tack them all together in the jig. Now, one of the downfalls of my jig is the part that holds the steering stem is only an M12 threaded rod. So it is particularly flexible, so you need to be cognizant of this fact and weld everything in a sequence to avoid distorting your whole chassis. Now, with the lower part of the frame complete, it was time to get to work on the upper part of the frame. This process is essentially the same. Mount everything, make sure it's all parallel, bend all the tubes, tack it together. But before doing the upper part of the frame, it was time to dummy mount the swing arm and attach the shock so we could see where the upper shock mount was going to live. The shock was straight from AliExpress, and the bushes for the lower link required a small amount of machining to get them to fit on our pit bike swing arm. So what you can see now is I'm welding up the upper pivot point for the shock. It is made out of some very overkill heavy duty steel. So David's just lining up the rear shock, making sure it's central. We've decided to mount it to this lower engine mount tube, not really for any reason other than the length the shock is. That's the angle the swing arm will be sitting on the ground. This is exactly as the bike will sit. So the only concern here is that this is quite a long stick out from this tube, so there could be some twisting motion, so we're going to probably brace this to the engine mount or something like that. So now that the whole thing's pretty much welded, all I've got to do is attach a couple of pieces here on each side for the rear sets to bolt up to. And then I think I'm going to put a cross brace through here, but I'm a bit undecided yet. I might just see how it handles first. It might not need the extra bracing. Yeah, and I also need to cut these off and then place some extra spacers to pack them out so I can move the engine around if I decide to change to a wider chain or whatnot. Next up, I've got to make these reset mounts. So we've got this piece of scrap steel. I think it's about 6mm thick. I'm going to cut it in half lengthways, also shorten it and make it fit in here nicely and round the edges off. So after having a conversation with someone who knows a bit more than me, I decided to cut off these mounts here for the rear shock, and I've made up this piece. It's essentially just a curve with a couple little notches in the end. These are loose, they're just 20mm holes, so I can wiggle it all around. I'll tack it all up with the shock there and then fully weld it later on when I'm certain. So I wasn't happy with this after talking to someone a lot smarter than myself. The unsupported bends, they would have just made the rear of the chassis flex and wallow around. So by putting this in here and tying this to this bar with probably a couple diagonals, will make the whole thing a whole lot more rigid. So I glanced over a few things in this video, like the shortening of the pit bike forks, making the wheel spaces and putting everything together. So this is about as far as I'm going in this video. Make sure if I've left anything out, ask questions in the comment or anything you think I've missed, and I can cover that off in the next part. But that will involve making the subframe, doing an exhaust and mounting the fairing. The first test day is in August, so hopefully I have the bike all ready by then and the engine installed.